Hello and welcome to the Coaching Conversation podcast. This is your host, Salah Elleithy, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Nicole Fleming. Nicole is a fellow TBR trainer, training from the back of the room trainer. She's also the one who trained the trainers for TBR training. So I'm really excited to have her with me today. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you, Salah. Glad to be here.
It's been a while since we spoke. I think we had a recent conversation about learning and TBR in general, some of the concepts. So I wanted to explore further on this podcast, and hopefully others who will listen to this will benefit from the learning and the TBR concepts. So before we get started, I know we've talked on several occasions. I know you from the TBR community. How did you get where you are as a TBR trainer, or how did you get involved in this kind of work?
Yeah, I took a very kind of, long path to this. I actually graduated with a degree in microbiology and thought that teaching and training was not something I would really do. And I found myself working for a training company after spending about a decade in research and slowly got involved in actually, getting in front of the room and teaching people. I had the opportunity to meet Sharon, I think it was back in 2015. I was asked to help with one of her TBR classes, and I really enjoyed it. She's a great, great person. She has a wonderful personality. And I found myself helping her out several times a year with TBR classes. One thing kind of led to another. She encouraged me to get certified. And when she retired last January, I found myself in charge of training from the back of the room and the community, and it's something I've really enjoyed throughout the year.
I was looking through some of the earlier communication, or the first time I came across the training from the back of the room concepts, and it must have been, over a decade since I took the training, and it's really changed how I look at designing learning experiences and how people learn in general. But yeah, that's a great way to to get involved. Just to kind of like how you a lot of the guests that I've had on the podcast, they sort of have a similar experience where they started in one place, and then their career or their journey takes them on a different path, and then they end up in something different, or sort of evolve into another field. How do you like designing learning experience in general? What stands out to you as you got into this space?
Well, so my dad was a teacher, and my original thought for a career was education. And so I did take curriculum design classes, educational psychology, some of the early childhood development. And I quickly realized that I was probably not cut out for teaching in that way. Um, what really changed for me when I learned about training from the back of the room and started, you know, implementing the techniques was that this was something that I felt comfortable doing. With training from the back of the room, we really make it a point to take the spotlight off of the instructor and put the spotlight more on the students. And that's
Mhm.
something that I'm way more comfortable doing. So that's one thing about, the training from the back of the room design that really, really made it so that anyone can be comfortable facilitating training like this, even someone who doesn't like to be, on center stage.
Yeah, I do know that the Sharon also came from like the education background, and then sort of 20 plus years or more in education, and like you said, the idea of shifting the focus from like the trainer centered, kind of like the sage on the stage, or someone who is constantly teaching, to learner focused. And that was a shift that really made me embrace this concept, not just as a trainer, but also as a coach in terms of helping teams and organizations. So when you start to teach these concepts, what are some of the elements that you sort of like the ingredients to design a learning experience to make it more about the learner and not about the teacher or the instructor?
Part of it is really about how the new information is given to the learner. Traditionally, it's the teacher or the trainer up in front sharing the new information verbally. And with training from the back of the room, we encourage the teacher or the trainer to find different ways to get the learners to discover the new information, or at the very least, to give short bursts of lecture while the students are doing something. And that's one of the key components. So breaking it into shorter chunks, making
Mm.
it so that the students are more involved with the process. One of the key tenets is also movement. I'm very passionate about this. I think that sitting for extended periods of time really breaks your focus and
Mm.
makes it hard to pay attention. And so with breaking the content up into smaller pieces, incorporating things like movement, talking, and writing, that's really key to the training from the back of the room design.
Movement is usually underrated in terms of how we learn. Even in classrooms in general, like in schools, where students are sitting for long periods of time and consuming information from the teacher. And I remember one of the things that Sharon introduced the class to in the work. I can't remember the name of the author, but the book is called Brain Rules. You may be familiar with this, and he has a really entertainment or edutainment, edutaining videos about like how kids are they're thinking in the classroom versus on the playground, for example, and how they're it activates a lot of their brain and cognitive abilities. So I'm surprised that we're in 2026 and still sort of the traditional approach to educating students or even training in the workplace, there is a lot of the traditional approach to teaching. You sit in the classroom, there are a lot of PowerPoint slides, and then that's how we convey information.
John Medina,
John
who
Medina,
wrote the
yes.
Brain Rules book, he
Yes.
goes so far as to say that we are sitting ourselves to death.
Mm.
And as kids, we don't have that, oh, we're supposed to sit and be still and quiet. As kids, they're wired to be moving. And I think as we go through school, we're kind of conditioned to be able to sit for long periods of time. And by the time you get to our age, right, you have to have these devices to remind you to move every hour.
Yeah.
We're actually doing a lot of damage to our bodies in this way.
Mm.
We're not designed to sit for long periods of time. We're designed to be up and moving. And so you
Yeah.
can have back issues. And I won't go into all of that, but
Right.
yeah, it's a really important thing.
It's part of just getting your I mean, I know when we were in the training from the back of the room, like I was surprised by this statistics. Maybe it's something that some people are familiar with, but there's like you just standing up, it sort of supply your brain with oxygen. And we know that like, walking or jogging or running or any type of physical activities, it give your brain more oxygen and that can help you think better and that's why like a lot of times when I go on a walk I start to get more clarity on something that I'm working on and come back with fresh ideas versus sitting for hours trying to figure something out. So that's one of the concepts or one of the things movement. What other concepts that or ingredients that you bring to the design of that learning experience? You mentioned movement, you mentioned writing, maybe talking about the material. What other elements?
So we have the six learning principles
Mm.
in training from the back of the room, and you have mentioned several of them. So the ones that are left are images, and we've kind of changed that to images and words
Mm.
because we do know that when we use images and words together, it helps us remember information for a longer period of time. And then we've kind of talked about shorter. but breaking pieces of the content or longer times where instruction is necessary, just kind of breaking that up into shorter pieces. And that really helps with being able to remember the information and pay attention. We're not overloading the brain with information. And then the one last one is different. You can think of that one more as like variety. So you're making it new and different so the kids or adults aren't experiencing the same thing over and over again.
The shorter segments or chunking can also apply to work in general. A lot of times when we try to build something, whether it's an application or product, it helps to break it down into smaller chunks so that we can build something sooner and bring some get some feedback. You know, while we're talking about learning specifically, these ideas can also are relevant to other parts of work in general. So those are the six learning principles. How do they fit into the learning experience as a whole?
So they are principles that you should see throughout the entire learning experience. So if you think of maybe a day long training or a day long class, you would see these principles, spread throughout in the activities that are done. So about every 10 minutes, you want to kind of change it up. If it's not something like programmers who are really involved in a process and really, excited about what they're doing, about every 10 minutes, you want to be doing something
Mm,
different, either writing or turning and talking to someone, or, doing a short activity to reinforce what was just taught. And then another key thing is the practice part. Often we go to a great session and we receive all this new information, and then we don't actually get to do anything with it. And when you have someone practice what you have taught them, you actually see that your content delivery was successful.
mm.
And so that's another key component is seeing your learners do something new with what you have given them.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that in a minute, like the idea of like observable behavior, because it's again, when there is a learning experience, it's hard to measure the retention or whether the learners actually walked away with some concrete practice. But I'm wondering, I know you've traveled a lot, you've done learning, teaching, training for the back of the room concepts in different parts of the world, and also you're involved in education as well, or you have some experience in education. How is it different or similar that we learn, whether it's based on the students like kids versus adults, for example, and in different cultures? Is there any have you seen any similarities or differences?
Yeah, it looks the same across
Mhm.
cultures, across age groups. The physical process, the biological process of learning is pretty much the same. Where you do see some differences are the experience. So as adults, we have a lot more to kind of draw on. We've been around a lot longer, so we have more experiences, and that can impact how we take in information or how we kind of feel about the information. But the process is the same.
Mm.
And when I've been very interested, I've worked with a lot of adults in adult learning, and I've had some teachers in classes here and there, but I had the opportunity last year to travel to Egypt,
Mm.
and we had 40 teachers in a training from the back of the room class, which is the largest group of teachers that I've done
Wow.
at one time. So I was really curious to hear the feedback on the techniques. Because we had everyone from like kindergarten through 12th grade. And
Mm.
you would think that in kindergarten, they're applying most of these techniques. They're not having the kids sit, they're having the kids engaged in the learning and moving and doing different things. So I was really curious to hear the feedback and whether they thought that this was new information that they could still apply. And I we got great feedback. We heard from people that yes, this was new information. This is still very applicable from kindergarten through 12th grade. They had a few more concerns about allowing the kids to move and, would it turn
Mm,
into chaos? And more concerns about, well, you're telling me that things need to be different, but as teachers, we know that structure with kids is very important. So
mm.
how do we, accommodate differences within a structure? But other than that, I heard a lot of the same things that I hear when I teach people who work with adult learners. And that was really great. And there weren't any, other than a couple of things that they're like, oh, maybe you shouldn't say that. That sounds like something, a word that is something not appropriate for schools,
Right.
with the English Arabic translation. Culturally, everything went over the same way as well.
I've had similar conversation with Arabic speaking trainers in also Dubai or and it's really I heard the same feedback in terms of like the concepts are universal or the learning principles are universal regardless of the culture and age as well because as you mentioned we learned the same. I mean, we were kids and and then now we're adults. So sort of the learning process hasn't changed much. But we do know now that traditional learning or traditional approach to teaching is not really very effective. And one of the things that I remember sort of visualizing as Sharon, or maybe I saw that in one of her books, brain science book, or the other 65 training, concepts, is this sort of a spectrum or a range. Traditional learning on one end of the spectrum and accelerated learning on another end of the spectrum. And you sort of get as you are designing the learning experience, you sort of tweak or dial them up or down based on the group. Because I hear that with adults as well. Like for teachers, you mentioned that the worry is that breaks or movement can take more time and then bringing the students back to the classroom and that takes time. Same with adults, when the adults are in like sort of a workshop, bring everybody back and help them. But I don't know if you've noticed that to be any a challenge when you design for breaks or movements or having people pair up and talk to each other or these kind of the activities based on learning principles.
What it kind of comes back to is classroom management techniques. And if
Hmm.
you have some strong classroom management techniques in place, you're doing some short time boxes, you have either some sounds or signals that all of the kids or adults know that when they hear that or see that, that's the mouths go quiet and
Hmm.
attention is back to the teacher. If you have those things in place, I really think that these techniques are successful. And this is what we've heard from teachers and from other trainers. And I think what you find is that when you are doing some of these techniques, they might be considered fun, although we don't, we don't
Yeah.
say, oh, do them because they're fun. We say do them because they're effective, but they
Mm,
are fun. They do make learning more enjoyable. And when
mm,
you have something fun that is ending, maybe you want to keep talking or doing that thing, but you know that the next thing is coming.
mm,
So it's not just the one thing out of the hour that you're doing that's fun. The next activity or the next thing that you're going to be involved in is going to be equally as fun. So then you are willing to give the focus back to the teacher, the trainer, and move on to the next thing.
there's a warning about laughs may occur.
I love
Because
that.
I think the learning principles, like some of the humor of or the sort of lightheartedness that kind of emerge from applying those principles in the learning experience that brings more like joy and fun and even sort of retention. Because again, like if we think about an experience where everyone is sitting timid in the classroom, just can't make a sound, you can't talk, you just have to kind of listen to the teacher or the instructor, how is that impacting you as a learner? You're probably not really, in a state to accept or to receive the learning that is happening versus if there's a lot of, like you said, the principles of movement, writing, talking, these principles help in getting people more relaxed to be able to receive the information or the concepts that the trainer is teaching.
This always takes me back to one of my favorite sayings from Sharon Bowman, who wrote the books and designed this curriculum. She would always say in the training from the back of the room classes, learning is messy.
Mm,
And it does. It looks a little more messy and chaotic than what you would think of a traditional like learning environment. When we went to school, the kids aren't sitting in individual desks silently working on something. It does. It looks a little more chaotic, but it's actually more effective. And I think part of the hard part is changing that mindset that
mm.
no, it's not that I've lost control. It's not that the students aren't learning because they're silent. It's just getting comfortable with a little bit more messiness.
And I think that's where it's hard for whether it's teachers in a classroom or leaders in a company. They both, when they hear messiness or messy, they tend to feel uncomfortable or want to have more controls or structure. So speaking of structure, there is a structure. There is a method to the madness, if you will, when designing a learning experience with training from the back of the room. And there are a lot of instructional design frameworks, but one of the things that I find powerful and about the TBR framework is its simplicity and resonance. So talk a little bit more about what's sort of called the four C's or the framework for TBR.
It's a very simple, but honestly, really powerful, kind of like a template that you can use to build out your classes or your trainings. And this is one thing, even though I took curriculum design classes in college, it was still a struggle for me.
Mm,
And what we really encourage with the four C's is to start with a learning outcome. And I know I've seen stuff on social media lately where people are like, "Oh, do we really need the learning outcome? Isn't that
mm,
outdated?" But really, that is your guide for your lesson. And if you look at that, you're asking, what are my students going to walk away with? What am I
mm,
going to see them doing during my session that shows me they've learned what I've wanted them to? So it all starts with that. And even though I start a little backwards with the four C's, I'm going to explain them in order because I think that makes the most sense. So our C1 is our connection, and really the goal there is connecting learners with each other and
mm,
with the content. And we do that because once we connect learners to each other, we're starting to build that safe and supportive learning environment that we need to feel comfortable, taking some small risks and learning. And we connect learners to the content because we know from neuroscientists that once we build onto what people already know, it's easier. So we're extending those
mm,
neural pathways. And then the second part of the template is the concepts. And that's just new information that we're sharing. And as we said, we were trying to do that in some interactive ways. Lecture is still okay, but you can have people write on a graphic organizer as you're lecturing. The third step is the concrete practice. And that's where the learners are doing something with the new information. So you can actually see them doing, the thing that you've wanted them to learn. And often that's where your learning outcome ties in. So you can see that new learning taking place. And then the last part, that's our C4, our conclusions. We
mm,
want to wrap everything up. Often it's something that gets dropped because we're short on time,
mm.
but that's really about planning how you're going to use the new information. Might be an action plan or summarizing the information or figuring out if you can actually use it. So it is very important.
The connection piece, it's really, when I think about the connection piece, or at least the how instructors or teachers usually start the a session from, let's say, like from an organization perspective or an adult learning environment, people may think like, oh, connecting meaning like everyone go around and say their name and their role, but that's not really what we're talking about.
So I'm a shy introvert, and anytime that I go into a session and we have to sit in a circle and go around and introduce ourselves and say a little bit about what we do, I'm not paying attention to what everybody else is saying because I'm trying to figure out what to say for myself.
Hmm.
And this is, I love that you point this out because we're talking about one-on-one conversations to start with. We're talking about low risk,
Mm.
building, some small bonds with each other. And over time, we're going to meet everybody, but we don't need to do it all at once at the beginning because we're not going to remember all of that anyway.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the connecting with each other, because I love that the fact that the connection is not just the connecting. There are three different aspects: the connection to each other as a learner, as learners or as a learning group, connection to the material, because sort of like you mentioned earlier, you draw back on or connect things that you already know. I mean, people don't come as a clean slate. They already have some background experience about a topic, so if you connect it to something you already know, then that helps. And then connecting to the trainer or the facilitator, right? Because again, like you said, the safety, building the safety to take small risks, because a lot of time people may show up and they're in their bubble, or they don't want to say anything or do anything that make them look like they don't know what they're doing. And it helps to create this environment or atmosphere for learning. Anything else about the connection? I'm sort of like digging a little deeper into the each C to get your thoughts and experience.
If you show up to a training from the back of the room class, you'll notice that the trainer introduction doesn't happen for like 4 slides in.
Mm.
And the very first thing that we do is get the learners connected to each other and the content. And that has a very powerful purpose of putting the importance of, what we're doing there on the learners and the content and showing that I'm not the most important thing as the teacher or trainer in the space. I think
Mm.
that really has a really big psychological impact for people, and it's very different than what you normally experience. It's
Mm.
normally the first, what, 10 10 minutes is here's
Yeah.
who I am and here's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it ties back to what you said earlier about moving the focus from teacher or instructor centered to learner centered. Because again, I think there is a lot of things that sometimes I remember from Sharon's class about you want them to learn, or do you want to talk, right? So as a teacher, I mean, the person who does the most talking learns the most. So if the teacher is doing the most talking, then the learners are not really the ones learning, right? I love what you're saying about connection and getting the learners ready. This is sort of like the warm up to what is going to happen in the next segment. So then the second C is the concept, right? The teaching the concept. And again, this is not the same as lecturing or death by PowerPoint type of it's something different.
Yes, and the what I tend to do is I start with the concrete practice. What are they going to do? And
Mm-hmm.
then I ask myself, what is the minimum amount of information, of new information that I need to share to get them there? And lots of times we have so much we want to share and say that it's too much for our time box. And I find that that type of thinking really helps me pare down the new content that gets shared. And then exactly, it's not death by PowerPoint. It's how can we get this to them in an interactive way? Can they
Mm-hmm.
data hunt? Can they go search on the internet or in books? It might be a worksheet or a short lecture, but as we said, they're doing things along the way to kind of break that up.
And you're weaving in the six learning principles into the different framework, the parts of the framework as you design the learning experience.
Absolutely.
One thing I was reminded as you were talking is this idea of the need to know versus the nice to know, because a lot of time the teacher or the instructor, the facilitator of the class, they have a lot of things to cover, and so to try to cram everything into that short period of time is very difficult, and that's why they don't have time to have people move around and do all these things. So how do you recommend people, or specifically teachers or instructors or learning facilitators, to identify that need to know versus nice to know? Because, a lot of time we want to convey our wisdom into the students, and we want to give it all, right?
Yeah, that's a really hard thing. We know we have a lot of good information, but I think once you kind of take a step back and just know that if you share everything, it's not going to land. They're not going to
Mm-hmm.
remember all of that. So really the key is looking at the learning principle. What are they going to be able to do with this? And the need to know is the information that can get them there. So what do they absolutely need to be able to complete the learning outcome and do the practice? And if that extra information doesn't apply there, that's nice to know.
Mm.
And that could be a handout, that could be, a video that they can follow up on later, but it's just going to overload their brains and they're not going to be able to take it all in. So, it's hard to
Yeah,
cut that stuff out, but
right. It's very similar to product teams or teams in general, where they want to do everything, and it's sort of prioritizing what needs to be done based on the goal, or in this case, the learning outcome. What do you want them to learn that will help identify these are the need to know, and this is nice to know, so we can just remove or cut that part because it's not important.
yeah,
Um,
that minimum viable product, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it may not have the bells and whistles or,
mm,
it may not look pretty, but it works. And
yeah.
that is what you need to start with and then build onto it.
In this case, like the minimum learning experience, or maybe
Exactly.
the MLE. We can come up with a new term. So that's the concept, and then the concrete practice is, now they're actually practicing what they learned. What does that look like?
Sometimes that looks like teaching someone else what you've learned. It can look like a role play. It can look like, just doing the thing. So if you're teaching somebody to play a scale on the piano, sometimes it's just playing the scale on the piano, but it's a practice that transfers really well to what the learners are going to do with it later.
Mm,
And sometimes that's really hard in a classroom. If you're
yeah.
teaching actual skills on, how to change the oil on a car, it's not always practical to bring in the engine or the car to be able to do that, but it's
Mm.
how can you make that as realistic as possible with what they're going to do, back at their job or wherever that they're taking that learning back to.
Yeah, I remember the teach backs were essential, or at least, like, it helps to gauge, did I really learn the material as much as I thought I did?
Yeah.
Or am I just sort of like hearing things and not really understanding what it is? Because there's this concept as well, the understanding portion of the thing. How do you know that the learners understood what the instructor, or the facilitator has taught them? I don't know if this is a good segue to the behavior, like the observable outcome yet, or should we tackle the final part, which is the conclusion? Because that's important also to wrap up, like you said. A lot of time, we just move from one topic to the next without sort of like completion, or sort of closure on this particular topic.
Often the observable outcome will come in the third step. which is the
Mhm.
concrete practice. Sometimes it's in the fourth step, but that's where you want to, see your learners doing that thing that was your goal for the lesson. And you named it, that teach back. Once you have to describe or share something with someone else, you really figure out how much you know
Mm.
because it's hard to, it can be hard to explain things to others. So that's a great activity to really kind of test your learning and see if you know it well enough to explain it to someone else.
There is a formula, or at least from what I remember, to craft this observable behavior. And there are a lot of times when I design the training with the clients, or at least, just to help them with develop the content, I see the learning, the outcomes, or that they come up with is to know the topic. So something that's really hard to notice, right?
Yeah.
How do you know that they actually know what they've been taught?
Yeah, unless you're able to kind of see inside someone's brain and realize that they know it or they understand it, you can't see that. But you can see the output of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which looks like, teaching someone else or building something. That's one of those things that you can see. So we usually encourage people to do a learning outcome, which is a skill plus an observable action word. That's your learning outcome. And that looks like being able to teach someone else or do that thing or, build the thing or even describe it.
I think as the learners start to build on using these learning principles, whether they talk about it, they write about it, they get up and move around and boost their cognitive retention, or the retention of the information, it helps them show how they were able to retain, or the information. And then there is the repetition of things, like the how they repeat things in different ways. Like you said earlier, different is better than same as one of the principles, because people get bored and check out very quickly, especially nowadays, where they just expecting some novelty all the time.
Yeah, and we don't always get things the same way.
Hmm.
We're different. And so if you try the same approach for repeating things, maybe it doesn't work out for, the one person, but if it's explained a slightly different way, then they get it that way. So not
Mm.
only are you not making it boring, but you're also allowing for people who think in a slightly different way to get those things. So it works out well
Yeah.
for many reasons.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I know that there's in the class there are some graphic organizers, or visual, for visual learners. There's also the logical way of thinking. So some of us, I like visual things. Some other learners may like to have more of a logical way of thinking, or a combination, maybe trying different things. So we've talked about how we learn, as whether it doesn't matter whether we're young or old. It doesn't matter, because the different age doesn't really matter how we learn as adults or children. There's also, we talked about the six learning principles. We talked about the framework of the four C's framework. What else can you recommend as far as designing a learning experience that helps the learner retain the information, or come back later and think, oh, I remember this from the class that I did maybe a couple weeks ago or a month ago?
So one thing is spaced practice, and that's just following up on the content that was learned. If you attend a training from the back of the room class, we give you a little bit of pre-work to kind of, get your brain going so you know what you're showing up with. You take the class, and then we have some activities that you can do at various times after the class. And that's just important to bring that information back to your brain and you're repeating it. You're doing it again. You're doing new things with it. We might encourage you to teach your colleagues what you've
Hmm.
learned, to read a few blogs. So it's really just revisiting that information every now and then.
Yeah, that's sort of like coming again full cycle to continue to retain what the learners, what the person has learned. So I know we're coming to the end, but I wanted to actually explore like one thing that I know we talked about what helps us learn, but do you see anything that gets in the way of learning? You know, sometimes it's sort of there is still this things that might get in the way of us learning or retain, even though we've designed that learning experience using all of these tools and techniques. What are some things that you've seen that can just impede or get in the way of the learning?
So some of us show up with experiences that maybe we didn't have a great time in school. And we show up and we see something that reminds us of that learning environment that we really had a bad experience with. And we tend to shut down. And, that really just ties back into that building that safe and supportive learning environment. And
Mm-hmm.
we just really have to be aware that not everybody has had that throughout their lives. And, some of us are shy introverts and we've been to trainings or classes where we've felt put on the spot and very uncomfortable. And that can really impede learning because,
Mm.
you're not thinking about, oh, what's this new information? I'm going to collaborate with these great people. You're thinking about, oh, I had this terrible experience.
Mm.
And so, one other thing that I'm very big on is creating a learning environment that is low risk at first. So get everyone comfortable with each other. One of our other concepts in training from the back of the room is the right to pass.
Mm.
So we have the right to pass on any activity that, you're not comfortable doing at the time. And that's something I carry forward into all of my sessions. And I really encourage people to take care of themselves first. Because if they're not doing that, if they're uncomfortable, if they're, feeling put on the spot, they're not going to be able to learn. And so those are some things that I really, encourage people to do. Think about the movement that contributes to that. And you've got to know your audience, but if there is an uncomfortable part, if they have to take a test or they have to do a presentation, maybe
Yeah.
it suggests that they move and take some deep breaths to kind of calm down. It's really interesting that taking the training from the back of the room class and learning these techniques that we suggest for our learners have actually really made a big difference for me as a facilitator. I'm not really comfortable in front of the room, and so before things start, I do that myself. I walk around and take some deep breaths. So I'd really encourage people who are creating learning environments to think about how safe and supportive that learning environment is and whether they can offer the right to pass and whether they've started with low risk activities.
Yeah, the right to pass or creating low risk activities is very important because, like you said, it makes the difference between people engaging or connecting or sort of shuts down the willingness to even try. And it reminds me of the concept in gaming, or at least like playing a game is like opt-in participation. You're not forced to play. You choose, right, to play, or you're willing. You play willingly, right? So yeah, the right to pass, if people feel like they're forced to learn or to do a certain activity, then that gets in the way of learning, and that makes the environment very stressful to be able to learn. And I also like that you brought this as on at the personal level. I do the same thing. Like sometimes, just breathing before you embark on some activity or present or teach a class, because that helps also the facilitator to get in that state of mind where they can connect with people, because it's really it's a lot of activities and socialization at the end, if you're an introvert like me as well, I really need some time to sort of recover or recharge. Thank you for bringing that up. Anything else that you want to share before we conclude or come to our end of the
I
conversation?
think I think you brought up a really interesting point there with, the introvert and taking some time back. Don't be afraid to put in some of those silent individual activities.
Mm.
That's part of varying the activities is talking, but also some silent ones. Your introverts will thank you for that.
Mhm. Right. And so I really appreciate your time. I know you have been doing a lot of TBR training and you're introducing these concepts not just in organizations but also in educational institutions or schools as well. And that's really, important because we have to change how we think about learning and
Yeah.
retaining information or designing learning experiences in general. If we are going to solve the next problems or open the possibilities for the students coming into the workplace. Thank you very much, Nicole. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.